Is Disney set for a fall? Today I'm going to be looking at some data that shows that Disney might be in trouble when it comes to their studio entertainment division because of their over-eager shopping spree from the last 15 years. I have some statistics that I want to look at of how much money they've made back or haven't made back from all these big purchases like Star Wars, Pixar, Marvel, etc. Just like an empire, no great company is immune to falling. No great company is immune to becoming irrelevant. And I am going to be taking a look at the blockbusters that Disney has released and really how they have not made back their money, and in many cases they're losing their audience. Before we get into looking at the data, let me just explain how revenues from movies work. So when you think of a big blockbuster, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, is particularly blockbusters, they have bigger budgets, all right? So often it's going to take between $150 to $250 million just to make movie. The marketing budget is completely separate from the regular movie production budget. They don't include that. That's a separate number. And that also is a very high number. That can be between 100 million, 200 million. When you're looking at something like Endgame, it probably even passed $220, $250 million just to market that film because you want as many people to see it as possible. They don't always release how much they've spent on marketing, and they don't always release how much they're making on video on demand. So here's what I did when I looked at these figures. So I didn't include marketing in how much they spent on this movie. That would have been more money that they would have to make back. On top of how much it took to make the blockbuster, they would have to make their marketing budget back. And the reason I didn't include it is they don't often release it. And they also don't release how much they make back on streaming, so video on demand, or how much if you buy the movie. But those two things, those two numbers, so the marketing budget and then how much they're making back in video on demand, I'm going to say cancel each other out. So you're not making as much money back through video on demand that you used to with DVDs, which was this huge cash cow that pretty much disappeared. People do buy DVDs still, but not in the quantities that they used to in the height of DVDs, which was 2005, 2006. You're going to see that Disney is not making their money back on these big purchases that they have, and especially most recently with Fox. When Bob Iger took control of Disney in the early to mid-2000s, he decided that he wanted to expand the Disney empire by acquiring more properties. This started with Pixar. Has Disney made its money back from Pixar? No, it hasn't. Let's take a look at the figures. How much did they spend to buy Pixar? They spent $7.4 billion to buy Pixar. Over the course of 15, 16 years, Disney has taken in about $11.1 billion in revenue. That's how much they've made at the box office. These movies have made at the box office. But that's not actually how much Disney takes back. They only take about half of that from the box office. So already you're only taking back $5.5 billion. And then you have to include how much they spent to make these blockbuster movies, and that's about $2.6 billion. So altogether, how much has Disney lost if you put that together? They spend $7.4 billion, that's a loss at first. Then they take back $5.5 billion, and they spend $2.6 billion to make these movies. Overall, on Pixar, Disney is short about $4.5 billion before they would break even on Pixar. So next comes Marvel. Marvel is the anomaly here. Disney has made its money back on Marvel. So let's take a look at our numbers. Disney got a good deal on Marvel. Disney only paid $4.2 billion to buy Marvel. This was before comic book movies had really made their comeback, and Marvel was primarily responsible for that comeback. But Disney gets a great deal, buys Marvel for $4.2 billion. Over the last 12 years now, Marvel movies have made completely total at the box office worldwide $21.7 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. But when we actually break it down of how much money Disney has made off this deal, it's really not that much. So 50% of that $21 billion is about $10.9 billion. So Disney takes back out of the entire Marvel box office $10.9 billion. Now, What's the budget for these films? These films are extremely expensive. Some of the most expensive movies ever made. It cost about $4.1 billion for Disney to make all these Marvel movies over the last 12 years. I'm using Box Office Mojo as my basis for getting this number. I just took the box office totals for each of the movies since 2009 and added it up. And the take for Disney is 50% of that. We're just going to keep repeating that because that's important. When you see these big numbers, Disney's not making all that money back. They're making half of that back, sometimes less than half of that. But we're going to go with half. So to produce these movies, it pays $4.1 billion, which means that overall, they've spent about roughly $8 billion to get $10.9 billion back. Which means that they've only made, with Endgame, the biggest movie ever, $2.6 billion off Marvel over the course of 12 years. That, in comparison to what they're short on Pixar, is only about half of what they're short on Pixar for with what they've made on Marvel. Just think about how much money they're spending to make these movies and taking very, very little back. Okay, Marvel is in the black, but just barely. What's next after Marvel? So Disney buys Lucasfilm Star Wars in 2012. How much did they pay for it? They paid $4 billion. Again, it sounds like a pretty good deal. They paid $4 billion for Star Wars. I have the dog around. And at first it looks like it was going to be a great deal when The Force Awakens came out. They made bank at the box office. They took in $2.1 billion for that movie. So $2.1 billion for Force Awakens at the box office. However, over the course of time, by the time Solo came out, Solo was a complete train wreck. By the time The Rise of Skywalker came out in 2019, the audience for Star Wars, the big blockbuster Star Wars, not even just like one that they released in the middle of the year like Solo, had gone down by half. That's a big deal. They've lost half their audience for Star Wars films. That's pretty crazy. Let's take a look at those figures. Disney's original purchase price for Lucasfilms was $4 billion. Those movies have made of roughly $6 billion at the box office, leaves Disney with about $3 billion in take. So they spend $4 billion, they get back $3 billion, but then they spend another $1.3 billion at least, $1.3 billion to make those films, which leaves them with a complete loss on Star Wars Lucasfilms at this point. They still have to make about $2.4 billion at the box office to make up those Star Wars purchase, just the purchase. And now their most recent purchase, which is insane when you consider their other properties, is Fox. Disney buys Fox in 2019. How much did they spend for Fox? They spent $71 billion for Fox. Now, I know that some of that is for the other entertainment side of their business, but that is a big chunk of money considering how much they paid for Marvel, all right, which is their winner. And Fox franchises weren't doing fantastic when they bought it. X-Men was already on its way down. Let's just see how much it would take for Disney to make back their money on Fox. Right now, they most likely have not spent any money on movies to make Fox movies because they were already in production when Disney bought them, and what you've seen released in 2020 and now into 2021 are movies that had already been made or were already on the pipeline. And production stopped pretty much in 2020, so we haven't really seen any new movies come out that weren't already being made. So they've taken in, oh my goodness, it's not that much because of 2020. They've only taken in about $620 million at the box office from Fox properties after they came out. So, they just have to make back $70.4 billion to break even on their Fox deal. Let me just take you through the numbers for Endgame, because I think it's interesting to see how many Endgames it would take for Disney to make back its money on Fox. Endgame was a massive movie in 2019. It made $2.8 billion at the box office worldwide. That's huge. But it also took a lot of money to make it, within hundreds of millions of dollars. So you're looking at around $350 million to make that movie. So at the end of the day, Disney had a profit. Once you take the 50% of the box office take back, plus what it costs to make the movie, of about $1.11 billion, roughly $1 billion on that movie. Okay, so how many Endgames would Disney have to make in order to make back its money on Fox? 70 Endgames. They would have to make 70 Endgames in order to break even with with Fox. That's ridiculous. So overall, we're looking at this huge loss. How much overall? If you look at the data of how much they've spent to buy all these properties and how much they're short, they are short about $75 billion before they would make back their money overall. Now, Fox does give them content for Disney Plus, and Disney Plus has now surpassed, at least during this pandemic, what Disney is making in revenue versus their studio content. It's pretty hard to believe. Disney did have a rough year in 2020, but the signs were there in 2019 when they decided to take this huge bite of a big apple, Fox, when their other properties, they hadn't made much money back on them, at least in the studio entertainment way. So what does this mean? It means your crap piles up and it's gonna come back to bite you if you don't deal with it. Now, they've been buying since 2005. They've lost their Star Wars audience. They're not able to distribute through Beta Vista the same way that they were before the pandemic. Their parks have been closed. They're not making the same kind of money that they were before the pandemic. And even then, this major take a huge bite of the apple, we'll just use that Disney analogy, of buying Fox for billions and billions of dollars, at least 20 times more, basically 20 times more than what they paid for Marvel, is insane. Because these movies, these huge blockbusters, don't make money for Disney. Oftentimes they're losing money for Disney because they have to make back what they initially spent, and they're not doing that. They're just not doing that. So what are you going to see? You're going to start to see Disney sell off some of these properties. They've already just announced that they're going to close down Blue Sky Studios, which is tied to their Fox acquisition. They're actually going to shut that down. But I could see them selling off maybe Pixar, maybe Lucasfilms, that it's not doing anything for them. And I believe that they truly are in trouble here because they've spent tons of money on these big properties, but the blockbusters aren't making their money back for them. And that is going to only increase because of this new world we're living in where people aren't going to the movies in the same way that they were before. Will we ever see this audience size go back to where it was pre-COVID? And if not, how is Disney going to be able to afford to make these movies if they have to just release it straight to video? Or if they release it to the theaters, they just don't make back what they are planning to, those billion-dollar movies that don't end up bringing in a lot of revenue at the end of the day for them, and a lot of profit at the end of the day for them. So math, what do you think about the math? Does the math make sense? Should I do more math? This has been fun. This has been a lot of research. Thanks for listening, guys. This was interesting to me. I hope it was interesting to you.